The book of Exodus not only outlines the origins and practices of the Passover celebration, but also the plagues visited upon Egypt. It tells us how Yahweh first introduced himself to the ancestors of the Judean people, how he visited his wrath upon the wicked Egyptians, and the establishment of the covenant, which was the basis of their national identity. This book is central to the formation of the kingdoms of Israel and Judah, the very origin of the Promised Land. The covenant established between the people and Yahweh in the Exodus story is referenced throughout the subsequent biblical books and serves as the authority by which kings ruled and lands were conquered. Sacred groves were torched and shrines destroyed in accordance with this covenant. Because of this deal, the Jews made no images of their deity, worshipped only a single God, and all worship was centralized in a single temple. Yet centuries after this book was ostensibly written, the Jewish population living within Egypt who were in constant communication with the Jerusalem temple not only had no knowledge of the Exodus story, but they blatantly violated this covenant, and the Jerusalem temple had no issue with their idolatry and polytheism. I'm your host Jason, and you're listening to Dragons in Genesis. In the previous episode, we began our study of Ezekiel, covered his call to become a prophet, and began the section known as the warnings of calamity to come to Judah. Picking up where we left off, we'll be continuing those warnings against Judah, which conclude in chapter 24, and then we'll tackle the warnings of calamity to come to other nations. That section will cover chapters 25 to 32. If you haven't already listened to episode 90, go back and do that now. I'll wait. Back already? All right, let's get started. In chapter 17, the word of Yahweh once again comes to Ezekiel and commands him to speak an allegorical riddle to the house of Israel. The oracle given, which speaks of birds and trees, is about Egypt and Babylon, as well as the fate of the people of Judah. It starts with a great eagle, understood to be Yahweh, coming to Lebanon. There, we're to understand that this is not Lebanon itself, but Jerusalem, with its temple built of Lebanese cedar. The eagle took the uppermost branches of a great cedar tree, which represents not only the people of Judah, but also the great tree of life that stretched into the heavens, and he placed this tip in the land of trade, which is a pun on the word for Canaan. So the opening lines tell us that Yahweh established the Judean kings in the land of Canaan. There they were watered and grew and sprouted branches that turned toward this great eagle, meaning they worship Yahweh. But then the branches began to reach toward another eagle. We may be tempted to imagine this as another deity, but it's actually the Pharaoh of Egypt. What's happening here is the people are placing their trust in foreign powers instead of Yahweh, hoping Egypt will protect them from Babylon. As we find in verse 10, that trust is misplaced. When the east wind, which is Babylon, strikes against the tree, the other great eagle withers and abandons the cedar. This is Egypt failing to prevent the Babylonian victory over Jerusalem. The top of the cedar, meaning the Judean nobility, is then carried off to Babylon, so the mighty cedar may not grow so tall again. This is the sin of pride that will later be attributed to rebellious angels in 1 Enoch. Attempting to raise oneself up to challenge the pride of Yahweh ultimately results in humiliation. The proud are cast from their lofty perch to fall to the ground. In this case, the sin of Judah is rebellion against Nebuchadnezzar, who had established himself as ruler over Judah. Since Judah lost the war and the biblical writers can't imagine Yahweh losing, Nebuchadnezzar must have been an agent of Yahweh working against Judah. Therefore, rebellion against Nebuchadnezzar is rebellion against Yahweh. This detachment of Yahweh from the nation allows their religion of monolatrous Yahwism to withstand the fall of their kingdom. Yahweh didn't lose because Yahweh is always on the winning side, so any defeat of Judah is reimagined as a victory for Yahweh. Because Judah has broken its covenant with Yahweh, he attacks them. The imagery presented for that attack in verse 20 is that of his battle with Leviathan. He catches Judah in a net and drags the great beast out of the water as punishment, and it is carried off to Babylon. The chapter closes with a promise of restoration as Yahweh will once again break off a sprig from the mighty cedar and plant it on a lofty mountain at the highest point in Israel, where it will eventually bear fruit. He ends with the pronouncement that he will bring low the high tree and make high the low. This reversal of fates is typical of apocalyptic literature, and we first encountered it in our discussion of the lasting effects of Zoroastrianism on Second Temple Judaism. The idea that a person is judged by the actions of their parents is addressed by the next oracle. Yahweh commands the people to cease observing the proverb, "The parents have eaten sour grapes, and the children's teeth are set on edge." No longer shall this be the case. If a man is righteous and does not worship idols or eat food offerings on mountaintops or commit a host of other sins which are listed in verses 6 through 9 of chapter 18, then that man will live. And if his son commits these sins, then his son shall die. But the sins of one will not alter the fate of the other. This chapter addresses a key problem that arose in the exilic period. With the temple destroyed and the people displaced, how can they form and maintain a relationship with Yahweh? Where once they could present offerings of grain, oil, and other goods to the temple, now they have no temple in which to make such offerings. Thus they are separated from their patron god. Separation from their gods caused great anxiety in Egypt during the reign of Akhenaten, when their multitude of deities were supplanted by the Aten, who could be contacted by the king alone. Judah solves this problem by suspending the idea of the relationship through temple sacrifice and replacing it with a relationship through acts. As long as the people follow the covenant laid down by Yahweh, he shall look favorably upon them. Turn away from transgressions, and Yahweh will turn toward you. And if you maintain a righteous lifestyle, then one day your fortunes will be restored, just as the fortunes of the nation will be restored. This not only provides hope to a hopeless people living in exile, but it also lays the blame of Jerusalem's downfall and the current state of affairs at the feet of those who follow a different style of worship, thus providing a powerful polemic against worshippers of Yahweh who still sacrifice on mountaintops or keep idols of the patron deity in their homes. Chapter 19 gives us an oracle presented as fable concerning a lioness and her cubs. The mother lion represents Israel. She has 2 cubs, the first of which represents those who are carried off to Egypt. This is supposed to be our Jews living in captivity in Egypt, though it doesn't quite match the Exodus narrative as we have it now. It more closely resembles the story of Joseph, who was betrayed by his brother and sold to slavers who took him to Egypt. The second lion cub grew up big and strong, but he too was captured in a net, and he was taken to Babylon. This is King Zedekiah, who was blinded after his attempted escape during the siege of Jerusalem. He was taken in chains to Babylon to serve as an example to other vassal states of the penalty for rebellion. In verse 10, the oracle shifts from a fable about lions to one about vines. Israel is now a vine planted in a vineyard beside flowing waters, and it grew thick and strong, similar to the great cedar that we just saw. This vine was withered by the east wind, meaning Babylon, and then was consumed by fire. Because of this, there is no strong stem of the vine from which to fashion a scepter, meaning an end to the Judean kingship. Elders go to consult Yahweh several years after the exile has begun, but Yahweh no longer speaks with them directly and has Ezekiel deliver his message. He begins by reminding the people of the covenant he made with them in Egypt, that he would bring them out of captivity and deliver them into a land that he had set aside for them. If those people in the past would set aside their improper religious practices, they would not only be rewarded with freedom, but with a promised land that they could call their own. This is the message of the new leaders during the exile, which has been retrojected into the past, using a fictive prior exile in Egypt to serve as a parallel for their current situation in Babylon. The wrath that Yahweh would show against Babylon was then given precedent by claiming it had happened previously in Egypt. The prophets informed the people that Yahweh wishes to have a relationship with them now, just as he wished to have a relationship with their ancestors during their Egyptian captivity. Once they accept this covenant, he will lead them out of Babylon and into the wilderness between Mesopotamia and Judah, just as he led their ancestors across the Sinai during their wilderness travels. They are introduced to a new style of worship, with new laws which are to be upheld in order to appease Yahweh. This too is retrojected into the past and forms the idea of the covenant being delivered on the mountain. This represents the new theology which will be brought to Judah during the time of Ezra and Nehemiah, but was already forming in Babylon during the exile. Of course, one cannot simply introduce new ideas without also decrying the old form of worship, and this comes in verses 27 to 29 of chapter 20. The people of the First Temple period are likened to the Canaanites encountered by the invaders during the time of Joshua. These are the locals in Judah whose ancient practices seem blasphemous to the later generations. We return to the people living in Babylon who are called to change their worship away from that of their ancestors and fall in line with this new theology. They must abandon child sacrifice and idolatry. If they do, then they will be like those who left Egypt, gathered up and delivered to the promised land which flows with milk and honey. In verses 39 to 44, Yahweh draws his line in the sand. Those who wish to continue serving idols shall continue suffering punishments, while those who follow his new theology will be rewarded for their obedience. The chapter ends with threats of consuming violence against all who oppose Yahweh, in order to demonstrate his mighty power to the world. Chapter 20 ends with a fragment of an oracle against Negeb to the south, in which Yahweh threatens to burn the forest with his mighty wrath. Since Negeb was a desert, this fragment makes little sense. The solution is a simple one. In the 13th century CE, when the Bible was being divided into chapters and verses for easier reference, the chapter division was simply placed in the wrong spot. If we recognize that Ezekiel 20:45 is the beginning of the following chapter, then this ceases to be a fragment of an oracle about Negeb and becomes instead the symbolic destruction of Jerusalem. Some modern Bibles actually account for this by placing the chapter heading for 21 before the last 5 verses of chapter 20. The interpretation of those misplaced verses is that Yahweh is laying out his plans for Jerusalem. Ezekiel looks south from his home among the enemy to see the city of Jerusalem, a virtual forest of cedar. Yahweh draws his sharpened sword, and it's placed in the hand of the one he calls the Slayer. This is one of Yahweh's minions whose job it is to slaughter thousands. It's likely the same figure we saw in Exodus who killed the Egyptian firstborn. At the end of 2 Samuel, when David conducts a census at Yahweh's behest and earns the scorn of his deity. And finally when the Assyrians besieged Jerusalem, and 185,000 of them were slaughtered in their sleep. So once more, he's threatening to unleash his divine hitman, this time to bring ruin to his own city. But not just the city and its population, but also its leaders, as the princes of Jerusalem are given to the sword in verse 12. Yahweh then influences diviners in Babylon to influence the king in order to lead him to Jerusalem and bring about the destruction of the city. Nebuchadnezzar then plays stand-in for the divine slayer, brandishing Yahweh's sword personally as he cuts a path through the people of Judah. In the next chapter, Ezekiel explores the reasons for Yahweh's wrath being visited upon the city. We can divide this chapter into 3 sections. The first 16 verses outline Yahweh's issues with the city. Verses 17 to 22 concern the wrongdoings of the people. And the final verses of the chapter deal with the land of Judah. The city of Jerusalem is called bloody, a charge we've seen since the books of Kings, along with the charge of making idols. Within Jerusalem, innocent people and resident aliens are mistreated along with widows and orphans. Residents ignore the Sabbath, make offerings in hilltop shrines, and commit adultery and incest. Because of these crimes, Yahweh will purge the city of their corruption, so the city will recognize him as their God. When addressing the people, Yahweh compares them to ore in need of smelting. He will gather them up and smelt them in the furnace of Jerusalem, blowing fire onto them to melt them down and purify them. We've seen Yahweh breathing fire before, and though it's usually a metaphor, it isn't always, so we must consider the possibility that this could be another instance of him using dragon breath to exert his wrath. His fiery breath will smelt the people, so they will understand that he is their deity. Finally, he accuses the land of being wild and uncleared. It is in need of cleansing as it devours human lives and corrupted priests. This is the charge of ancient polytheism being a corrupting force to the newer monolatrous practices. The priests and prophets see false visions and spread false teachings, and the leaders oppress the poor. Because of this, Yahweh will consume them with fire. Chapter 23 takes a different approach to outlining the sins of the Jerusalem people than in previous chapters, though the theme is familiar, but the imagery is taken to excess. We're familiar with idolatry being referred to in terms of adultery, the city of Jerusalem depicted as a cheating spouse to symbolize the people following religious traditions which have fallen out of fashion in later Yahwism. Here in Ezekiel 23, the author shifts from the vague description similar to what's found in the Song of Solomon to language that can only be described as crudely pornographic. The chapter is concerned with two sisters who represent Samaria and Jerusalem. Samaria played the whore with her lovers, the Assyrians, adopting their ways and worshiping their idols. Because of her whoring, Yahweh delivered her into the hands of her lovers, for whom she lusted. She was then violated by them, and her children were slaughtered by the sword. After seeing her older sister's behavior, Jerusalem decided to one-up her. She followed in her sister's footsteps, whoring with the Assyrians, but followed that up with the Chaldeans. Yahweh, disgusted by Jerusalem following the ways of the Assyrians and the Babylonians, turned away from her. Jerusalem then played the whore with the Egyptians. This was when the city placed its trust in an alliance with Egypt rather than in Yahweh. So the patron god inspired her lovers to turn against her, just as he had done with her older sister Samaria. She was attacked by the Assyrians and then the Chaldeans, and then abandoned by Egypt. They mutilated her body and carried off her children. She was stripped naked, symbolic of the looting of the city. All of this was done as retribution for her corrupting herself with idols. She, being Jerusalem, will suffer the same punishment as Samaria. The chapter then recounts a long list of wrongdoings committed by the twin cities, which had each held temples to Yahweh. This chapter, with its graphic depictions of sex, human and animal sex organs, and brutality against the women who personify these two once holy cities, is one of the worst chapters in the entirety of the Bible. The warnings of calamity against Judah, which began in chapter 4, reach their culmination in chapter 24 on the eve of the fall of Jerusalem. The final siege of the city begins, and when it ends, the city will be razed, the temple looted, and the walls reduced to rubble. Many residents will be killed, and others will be carted off to Babylon. This is not only one of the darkest periods in the nation's ancient history, but also the catalyst for the creation of the Hebrew Bible. But that's a topic for another episode. The city is imagined as a boiling pot of stew filled with choice meat to represent the chosen people of Yahweh. The meat and bones are discarded, representing the deportation and slaughter of the people, but the pot itself is still corrupted by rust, representing the bloody city. The corruption of the populace is too deeply ingrained in the city for it to be cleansed by a simple removal of its people. Jerusalem itself must be destroyed and rebuilt to be purified, as is portrayed by the attempt to remove the rust from the pot by heating it in a roaring fire. Rust in the pot, resembling bloodstains, is imagery that is not lost on us. And blood crying out for vengeance is a theme common in Hebrew literature, first appearing in the Cain and Abel story in Genesis 4, as well as playing an important role in 1st Enoch. Recall in the first Ezekiel episode when Ezekiel must symbolically suffer in parallel with the residents of Jerusalem? That plotline resurfaces in verse 16 as Ezekiel is made to understand the fall of the temple by losing that which he loves most, his wife. So that the prophet can understand true suffering, Yahweh suddenly kills Ezekiel's wife and then prohibits the prophet from mourning her death. He must give no outward appearance of mourning, not even an audible sigh, but instead must address his audience to deliver oracles at Yahweh's behest. This is to parallel the exiles being forbidden to mourn the destruction of the temple and fate of the people, since their downfall comes at the command of Yahweh. It's no surprise this scene is conveniently overlooked in most Bible studies. The woman is the light of Ezekiel's eyes, and her sudden death without mourning is to foreshadow the destruction of the temple, news of which will soon reach the community living in Babylon. Now that Yahweh is finished with his oracles against Judah, he turns his attention on nations that are neighboring his chosen land in a section called Warnings of Calamity on Other Nations, which stretches from chapters 25 to 32. Yahweh's judgment begins on Judah's nearest neighbors, such as the Ammonites, Moabites, Edomites, and Philistines. The crimes listed against these nations in chapter 25 are all similar. When Yahweh turned against Judah and sent the Babylonians to destroy and pillage Jerusalem, these nearby neighbors either attacked Judah's territory or celebrated their defeat. It seems Yahweh alone is allowed to cheer for their downfall. Anyone else who does this must be punished alongside Judah. Despite the topic being these foreign lands, the focus continually shifts back to the temple and the land of Judah, as if these groups' sole focus was seeing Yahweh's temple demolished. What began as a conquering army moving through the region and yoking every nation in its path has now become the personal wrath of a spurned deity. In the years following the destruction of the temple, the exiled nation reimagines history as a personal vendetta. As Babylon attacks nearby nations, enemies of Judah, the writers of Ezekiel imagine these nations giving some offense against Yahweh, who wields Babylon's army like a sword. In this case, the offense given which earns their divine wrath is being an enemy of Yahweh's chosen land. This may seem confusing, as Yahweh both acts against the people of Judah and serves as their vindicator, so let me explain. During the Babylonian exile, a new form of national identity was formed among the community, one which began in the northern kingdom of Israel following their defeat at the hands of the Assyrians. This identity isn't defined by the land in which they live or even the deity they follow. It's an identity forged by humiliating defeat. The people who entered the land of Judah to build a new temple and worked with the backing of the Persians, who had recently conquered Babylon, were forged together by their decades of captivity. During that captivity, they were fused together by the idea of a new covenant between the captives and their deity. Because of this, they were unique. Even other worshippers of Yahweh were not true chosen people of Yahweh because those people hadn't experienced time in captivity. They were simply other worshippers who lived in the same land. They were known as people of the land. With this idea in mind, we can understand how Yahweh can work against Judah while simultaneously working against those who celebrated Judah's destruction. These authors see the neighbors of Judah as enemies because they celebrated the destruction of Yahweh's sanctuary. This was Yahweh's home and should have been respected, so their downfall is warranted. They also speak out against Judah and Jerusalem because it profaned the temple and disrespected Yahweh, a charge they can levy against the people of the land. The result is Yahweh acting against every person who has mistreated or even disagreed with the chosen people, meaning those who are living in exile. This means those in Judah and the surrounding lands, their allies in Egypt, Tyre, and Sidon, and even Yahweh's own instrument of vengeance, the Babylonians. These are all Yahweh's enemies. Those who go unpunished, like the Persians and the slave army sent to establish a government subservient to Persia, must be the righteous. In chapter 26, Yahweh turns his attention away from Judah's enemies and to its allies, beginning with Tyre. It's called a gateway of the people due to Tyre being a major trade center in the region. A point of note here is that Tyre's perceived crime is cheering the downfall of Jerusalem in order to inherit the trade that would have passed through this crossroads of a city. While Jerusalem would eventually become more important to trade, it was hardly a center of commerce prior to the Babylonian conquest. At this time in history, the primary city for such commerce in the region was none other than Tyre itself. So the author is being rather generous in his estimation of Jerusalem's importance to regional trade. The chapter contains a prophecy in which Yahweh details the downfall of Tyre at the hands of the Babylonians. The views expressed in this oracle give us an estimate on the date of its composition, somewhere between 586 and 574 BCE. The author is aware of the ongoing siege of Tyre, which spanned those years, but unaware of its outcome at the time of this chapter's writing. The oracle includes the complete destruction of Tyre's walls and dismantling of its defensive towers. The island will be stripped of settlement down to the bare rock, reduced to wilderness in the midst of the sea. Yahweh will bring Babylon against the city and its neighboring cities on the mainland. The deity will personally direct the Babylonian army, just as he directed Joshua's army against Jericho. Something of note here is that the description of the siege mirrors that of Jerusalem, which works quite well against a fortified hill, but wouldn't even remotely be effective against an island. This is the imagining of a person who was familiar with the siege of Jerusalem, but wasn't aware of the actual nature of siege against Tyre, so we know that the author wasn't in possession of divine knowledge. We're told that the residents of Tyre will be put to the sword and their city plundered. He even speaks directly to the city regarding its fate, that of a city that will vanish from the face of the earth, forgotten by the people. At the close of the chapter, the tone shifts from military destruction to the forces of nature that Yahweh wields. He will raise up the primordial sea, the Tehom, to consume the island, returning it to a state of pre-creation, just like in the days of Noah. This continues in chapter 27 in a song which depicts Tyre as a massive trade ship, a fitting symbol for the city. The chapter is written as a lament song to mourn, or perhaps celebrate, the death of Tyre. It's said in verse 3 that the song comes directly from Yahweh himself, so chapter 27 is a composition attributed to the creator of the universe. Similar to the Jerusalem temple, we're fed descriptions of the building materials used in the construction of this impressive vessel. Fir and cedar wood, ivory and embroidered linen, even sailors and rowers and soldiers, all gathered from the many nations that Tyre had trade with. Their broad trade network is described in terms of the goods traded through this city, bronze and turquoise and rubies. In the end, the mighty ship of Tyre will sink beneath the waves, taking with it all its riches and wares and wondrous construction, just as it did in the previous chapter. Again, the city will be completely destroyed and forgotten, never again to be inhabited. After 2 chapters against the city of Tyre, chapter 28 switches to an oracle against its king. Predictably, we find a prideful divine king who appears throughout this portion of the Bible. The chapter begins with the king of Tyre, his heart overproud, naming himself a god and placing himself on a high seat in heaven, the same sin of the fallen angels in 1 Enoch. He claims to be wiser than the hero Daniel, the figure from Canaanite mythology, and he knows all things, the same type of wisdom possessed by Solomon. And like Solomon, his wisdom leads to extraordinary wealth as he gathers up silver and gold from his massive trade network. Just like the residents of Eden, this king has obtained the wisdom of the gods, and like them he will be cast down from his lofty perch and become mortal and sentenced to die like a regular human. This too is the fate of angels who die like men when they attempt to usurp Yahweh's position. And like the angels of 1 Enoch, the king of Tyre will be cast into the pit. If this wasn't obvious enough, the tone becomes more clear in verse 12, as Yahweh states that the king of Tyre was perfect among creation, and indeed lived in the Garden of Eden, the heavenly mountaintop garden of Yahweh, guarded over by a cherub. This gives us 2 interesting pieces of information. First, as cherubs will later become classified as angels, this gives us our first glimpse of a guardian angel. Note, this is not a guardian angel in this chapter, as cherubim were not yet classified as angels, but divine beings which guarded over mortals, but that detail will later contribute to the legend of angels. Second, we see the original purpose of the cherub with the flaming sword stationed outside of Eden in Genesis 3. It became a guardian of the entrance to the garden after its occupants were exiled. It began as the guardian over those residents. The text then states that the king walked among the stones of fire, a detail we saw in the heavenly visions of Enoch. He was then driven out by his own guardian cherub because of his prideful heart, and was then consumed by fire taken from within himself, just as we saw in episode 90 when burning coals were pulled from the temple and used to ignite the city. This chapter offers us not only a glimpse into the deeper mythology of Eden, but also divine kings and fallen angels. So much so that the mythology contained in Ezekiel 28 will become instrumental in the development of the Satan character. This chapter is also a parallel to Isaiah 14, the prophecy against the king of Babylon, another chapter used to build the Satan figure. Another point of note here is that, in prior chapters, the cause of Tyre's destruction was its attitude toward Judah and celebrating its downfall. Now it has nothing to do with Judah or the temple's destruction, but a lesser god attempting to usurp the power of the Most High. Also, as in Enoch, the fall from heaven is followed by the casting of the angels into a pit and visitation of destruction from Yahweh. In verse 20, the subject of Yahweh's wrath shifts from Sidon as he attempts to gain glory for himself by attacking a city in Lebanon. In this city, he sends pestilence to slaughter the residents for mistreating their neighbor Israel. The chapter then ends with a promise of restoration from Yahweh to his chosen people. Leviathan is Yahweh's ancient enemy, a great and powerful chaos dragon depicted as a serpent living in the depths of the sea. To establish order, the chaos dragon had to be defeated. This is what's symbolized by the division of water in Genesis 1, a demythologized version of the story that was first told in the Enuma Elish, a Babylonian creation epic in which Marduk defeats Tiamat, and her body is split in two, its pieces used to create the world and the vault of heaven above. Enemies of Judah are depicted as enemies of Yahweh, and sometimes that means portraying them as a great chaos dragon, as we learned in the episodes covering Isaiah and Jeremiah. Here in chapter 29, we see a return to this theme as the Pharaoh and the nation of Egypt itself are depicted as a great sprawling dragon. Like Leviathan, he's hooked and drawn from the water by Yahweh and carved up to be served as a feast. This is not only creation imagery, but also the day of judgment, when the great primordial beasts are given as food to the angels and the righteous. The chapter begins with a poem about Egypt, the dragon, that spans the first 7 verses. That poem ends by reminding the reader that relying on Egypt for assistance is folly. This was a point made repeatedly in the previous 2 books. Judah should rely on Yahweh alone, not on foreign military alliances. The result of Egypt's pride, the same sin as Babylon, will be ruination of the land, the same fate experienced by Judah. And like Judah, the residents of Egypt will be scattered among the nations and later gathered up again and restored after a generation. Beginning in verse 17, the author returns to the topic of Babylon's siege on Tyre. Babylon's siege lasted until 573 BCE. Chapters 26 to 28 concern the certain fate of Tyre, including a lament psalm written as if Tyre's fall was a foregone conclusion, giving us a time frame for those chapters. They had almost certainly been written during the time of the siege from 586 to 573 BCE. The author assumed the fate of Tyre would be the same as that of Jerusalem. He didn't count on Tyre putting up a much better fight than Judah had. In 573 BCE, Babylon's siege on the island city of Tyre ended with the city still standing. There was no complete destruction of Tyre, no dismantling of its walls and towers, no burning of its homes, no stripping the island to bare rock. The prophecies of those 3 chapters failed to materialize. What seemed like a certainty certainly was not. And now, at the end of chapter 29, the author has to account for that. So he has Yahweh suddenly change his mind regarding the fate of the nation and give Egypt over to Babylon as a consolation prize instead. Usually prophecy is written after the events it portrays. When a prophet actually attempts to predict the future, we're treated with, ironically, predictable results. Their ability to foresee future events proves false, and we're met with awkward explanations, such as we find here. In the next chapter, we see the day of judgment over Egypt, which comes with storm clouds and a mighty sword, traditional symbols of Yahweh as both God of storms and of war. But his wrath isn't restricted to just Egypt, but its allies in Ethiopia, Libya, and Arabia as well. All those who lent aid to Egypt will see their cities destroyed and burned, and of course Nebuchadnezzar will be Yahweh's instrument of destruction. One symbol of desolation will be the drying up of the rivers and irrigation canals, an image used against Babylon and Rome in later generations. In the closing verses of the chapter, the focus switches to a specific event in the conflict between Egypt and Babylon. During the Jerusalem siege, the Babylonian army was briefly pulled back when the Pharaoh's army approached. The prophet uses Egypt's interference as cause for Egypt's later loss to Babylon. The nation is now wounded and given no time to heal as Yahweh sends his instrument of devastation against it. Just as Egypt is weakened, Babylon is strengthened, and no mercy is shown as it ruthlessly attacks its weakened foe. The people will be scattered among the nations. This is the fate of Judah, stamped onto the nation of Egypt. A new image for Jerusalem is used in chapter 31, that of the great tree of life, a towering sacred tree that reaches to the heavens, located at the center of the world. It's likened to the Lebanese cedar, tall and proud with branches among the clouds, providing safe nesting for all the birds of the sky and shelter for the grazing animals beneath its broad branches. It's the centerpiece of Eden and serves as a bridge between heaven and earth, the same as the Jerusalem temple. But its height is a symbol of its pride, and like the proud kings of Judah, it will be cast down into Sheol, the same fate of the prideful kings and rebellious angels. The warnings of calamity against other nations, and this episode, conclude with chapter 22, which fits better as a follow-up to the first half of chapter 29. We return to the imagery of Egypt as a dragon. The first 16 verses, like those of chapter 29, are a lament psalm for the fate of Egypt. The nation fancies itself a fearsome lion, but is actually a hunted crocodile, thrashing in the water as it is netted and hauled onto shore. The land and water will be drenched in its blood, and the sky will be darkened. The sun, moon, and stars are covered and unable to give light, as darkness covers the entire land. The rivers of blood and days of darkness will be used again in the Exodus story, and will reappear in Revelation, as the same wrath is threatened against the Romans. Their pride is to be punished with ruin as Babylon, Yahweh's sword, will be brought against them. Even their livestock will be punished, just as they will in the Exodus story. The nation of Egypt is sent down to the pit of Sheol in the second half of the chapter. Despite the great beauty of Egypt, the nation suffers humiliation. Like Assyria, another great nation cast down, Egypt is humbled. The great regional power has been brought low. The Edomites and Sidonians are swept up in the slaughter as well. That's going to wrap it up for this episode. You can help the show by giving a review on your favorite podcast app or by heading over to dragonsofgenesis.com, where you can find links to donate, join my Patreon, send books from my wish list, find a list of recommended reading, and get information on the latest episodes. And as always, thank you for listening.